ultimately what Augustine is teaching us in The City of God is that there can be no lasting peace between the city of God and any sort of current political arrangement. We can't put our hopes for the success of our highest ideals in a specific political arrangement. Although Augustine would say that the best kind of political arrangement would be a lot of sort of a communion of small local communities, because he believed that these would best foster the virtues of love and cooperation that were proper to the city of God.
What we are looking at here is a 1553 copy of a document written by Martin Luther in 1520. So it's fascinating because while it's not the very original text, it's very, very close to the original. You're having in your hands here, as it were, a 500-year-old text. And for Christians, this is fascinating because, like it or not, Martin Luther is a very important part of Christian history. A lot of times there's animosity between Catholics and Protestants. But this text is significant for me because we have the ecumenical movement these days, and we're trying to achieve unity between Catholics and non-Catholics. Well, one of the key aspects to unity is we have to know our history. We have to understand where we came from. And in this letter to the German nobility, Luther makes some of his complaints and arguments made very clearly. It's also important because in the current age we're in, looking ahead to the year 2017, we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which began in 1517. This is written just 3 years after the 95 Theses, which inaugurated the Reformation. Well, in this artifact we have a 16th century manuscript of the Hebrew Torah. Torah means law. So what we're looking at here is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the original text written by the author of the Old Testament. Now the one we're looking at here in this exhibit is from the 16th century AD, so some 1500 years at least removed from the original. One of the amazing things, though, is the fidelity you see in these manuscripts to their original because of the painstaking work of the Hebrew scribes, called the Masoretes, who in the Middle Ages really compiled this together and put little dots in it that you'll see that are the vowels. They weren't in the original. These Hebrew scribes put in the vowel markers so they would know how to read it and they would memorize it and pray it liturgically. And so this tradition is passed on through the centuries very authentically.
The Nasirian Ethics is a treatise by a Persian philosopher, Nasir ad-Din Tusi, who lived from 1201 to 1274. It was apparently one of the most circulated treatments in Persian of Islamic philosophy and the practical order. Our friend Nasir ad-Din Tusi actually relied on earlier thinkers. He explicitly quotes Al-Farabi, whom he calls the second teacher, that is to say, the one after Aristotle. And it was Farabi who seems to be the founder of Islamic political philosophy.
So the Remnant Trust is bringing in a collected works of Aristotle, the Opera, the works, from 1496. It was published in Venice at that time. And what the students can see from this, I think, is, this book is 500 years old, but that itself was 1,000 years after Aristotle died. In 1496, Aristotle had been dead for many, many years, but people had translated his work into Latin. It was, a serious, not bestseller even yet, and people wanted to piece together what this philosopher had to say about nature, about ethics, about how we should govern. This was one of the Renaissance works, so there was a sort of resurgence in interest in Greek philosophy and how we could make that come alive again in sort of rebuilding Western civilization. The thing about having Aristotle here is he's a terrific philosopher. He's really the best and the greatest. Aristotle's works are very common sense, very in-depth, very foundational, and he really tries to solve some of the greatest problems and does a terrific job on that.
What's interesting about having a leaflet from the Gutenberg Bible is that it comes from the original printing of the first Bible that was printed on the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg. The printing happened in 1455. So we have one of the original copies, and from my knowledge, there's only 180 copies that were actually made in the first printing. And it's right around this time that the Protestant Reformation happened. So before this, all books were handwritten manuscripts. There was no way to mass produce a book. Books were amazingly expensive. So what we have now is that books can be printed with the movable type that Gutenberg invented in a way that not only can books be made abundantly, but very cheaply as well. Now, at the same time, right around this time, just less than 70 years later, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, which would have been a scholarly debate. It was written out, posted on the church door for people to discuss with him, theologians, written in Latin originally. But it was translated into German, put on the printing press, and 300,000 copies of it were thrown around to the German Empire. So very quickly, these ideas that he wanted to originally discuss with theologians became a popular and political movement. So in many ways, we can say the Gutenberg press, which was invented, is sort of the necessary thing that needed to happen for the Protestant Reformation to take place.
On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres was a book written by Nicholas Copernicus. It has been called the most important book that no one read. However, some people obviously did read it, but there are very difficult parts to it. Copernicus was a canon at the Cathedral of Frauenburg in Ermland, which is now part of Poland. Early in his life, he became enthralled with the idea of the planets orbiting around the sun as opposed to the sun orbiting around the earth. And he spent much of his life working on perfecting this hypothesis. He was concerned about opposition from the church, but friendly inquiries from Rome and other parts of the church encouraged him and indicated that there was true interest in the ideas that he was trying to put together. The book has 6 initial subdivisions, 6 subbooks. The first one lists his assumptions of his hypothesis, which includes not only that the Earth is a planet orbiting the sun, but it also includes the fact that the Earth has to spin once every 24 hours and that the stars have to be at immense distances. All 3 of these ideas were very much in opposition to the currently prevailing view of the Earth-centered model of the universe, in which case, everything went around the Earth and the stars could be as close as possible. The title on the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres is credited with giving a new meaning to the term revolution, because this book overthrew the established view that the Earth was at the center of the universe. The definition of revolution that includes chaos and overthrowing authority comes from the title of this book, where the word revolution before that just meant orbital motion. So this book was truly revolutionary in what it did to our view of the universe. In 1616, when the church condemned the Copernican view of the universe, Galileo was specifically told that he could not teach this view. Galileo then waited until the intellectual Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII to write a book which indirectly supported the Copernican system. This book is the dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems and is a 4-day discussion between 3 philosophers, one of whom supports the Copernican point of view, one of whom supports the Earth-centered Ptolemaic point of view, and then a 3rd philosopher that interacts between the other 2. The book examines the pros and cons of both systems and the pros and cons and difficulties of the physics that supports them. The book was started in 1625 and finished in 1630, and then published in 1632. The book does not conclude that the Copernican system is correct, although most of the arguments come out favoring the Copernican system. Urban VIII, however, was so offended by the treatment of the subject matter that 5 months after the book was published in February, he had the book banned, and Galileo was called before the Inquisition. However, it remains one of the outstanding presentations of Renaissance science.
We'll have a copy of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, an absolutely fantastic document that students will get to see, and it will make real for them what Paine was talking about as far as the push for independence itself. This is a document that comes out in early 1776, and it is beyond the wildest dreams of what we would think of as a New York Times bestseller these days. If you calculate how many people had a copy of this as a percentage of the population, it far exceeds any sort of printed matter that we see today. Hundreds of thousands of copies of this made their way through the 13 colonies as a push toward trying to spur the movement toward independence. It's an amazing document, and students will be able to handle it here.
We are so used to the Declaration of Independence, it's sort of the air that we breathe. We don't realize how unique it really was in human. It's a turning point in human history. For the first time ever, a rebellious nation is saying not just, hey, we don't want to be under these guys anymore, but they're saying there are these principles that our country is going to stand for, that everyone should aspire to. And the people who made that statement were willing to sacrifice everything. You know, at the end of the Declaration, they say, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And that wasn't just hyperbole. They really were at risk of losing their lives, definitely their fortunes. I don't know about their sacred honor. But so when you hold that document was printed when they didn't know if they were going to win or lose, live or die, it adds a certain excitement. The power of those principles, the power of the idea that all men are created equal, that the purpose of government is to secure individual rights, so you have to have both majority rule and protection for the rights of each and every person, are so dramatic and so profound. They altered the world, they altered the political landscape, they altered the way people think about what governments owe them, what they owe each other, and what they can and should expect. You know, Abraham Lincoln, as he was on his way to be inaugurated, he stopped in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And he said, you know, I've often wondered what it was that was so special here, what more it was than just declaring independence. And he said, you know, when you think about the Declaration of Independence, it gave hope to the world for all future time. And I think that that is a legacy that we owe it to ourselves and to our children to try and live up to. So I just think that that's the impact that that document has that we constantly need to remind ourselves of.
You then shift to once the revolution has been fought, once independence has been won, once the ideals in Common Sense, in the Declaration of Independence, have been achieved, what's the next step? How do we actually create a nation? Benjamin Franklin said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the United States had proved that it was very good at conducting a revolution. How will it be now at governing itself? One of the documents in this collection is a fascinating exploration of that idea. It's John Adams wrote this, our second president. It's called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. And John Adams was a bit of a reactionary. John Adams was definitely not in the vein of Thomas Jefferson. He thought maybe this revolution had gone a little too far, and he's looking to impose some order on what he sees as perhaps chaos and disorder coming out of the revolutionary moment. And so he writes this document in 1788. This is at the time that Americans are debating America's second constitution, the Constitution of 1787 that we now are under. And in this document, he's calling for some restraint. John Adams is one of those men who talks about an enlightened class of leadership in America that should rule, that should govern, that should be a stabilizing force within the country. And he sees that in stark contrast to what's going on in a number of the states and even at the federal level by this point, that there needs to be some sort of stabilizing effect.
That document is certainly not one of the better known ones in this collection, but it's a very important one because it provides a counterbalance to the ideas of Thomas Paine or the ideas of Thomas Jefferson and the founders as written in the Declaration of Independence. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is one of those classic primary sources that really lets people experience what life was like as a slave, what it was like to be raised as a slave, and then ultimately to achieve one's freedom, to be able to obtain freedom, and then in the remarkable case of Frederick Douglass, to be able then to crusade for the cause of anti-slavery. I mean, here is a man who over the course of his life would be raised in slavery, but ultimately then would be lobbying the President of the United States to end the institution that he had been born into. It's a remarkable story. Talk about narrative arc there. That document, we'll have a first edition of that on campus this fall. As powerful as the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass was, there was actually another book written in the early 1850s in the wake of a whole host of crises in the country that really inflamed the anti-slavery spirit. It's written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's rumored that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War, he addressed her by saying, "So you're the little lady who started this conflict." It's written in the wake of the Compromise of 1850, which opened up some territories in the West potentially to slavery, closed some others to slavery. But perhaps the most controversial part of that compromise was that Congress passed a new and very strict, some would have called it draconian, fugitive slave law. And Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in response to, in many ways, the new fugitive slave law, which is absolutely, in its strictest form, forcing Northerners to be complicit in the return of slaves to the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin dramatizes that story, with the story of Eliza, and all these familiar characters. And students will be familiar with that story, to be sure. But again, it's sort of that textbook knowledge. Here, they're going to see a first edition of the book. The third document within this grouping on slavery is probably the most important Supreme Court case from before the Civil War, during the antebellum era. It's Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott is a slave who is taken by his master into a northern territory and resides there for a while. Scott, with the help of some anti-slavery friends, will sue for his freedom based on that fact. Says, I was taken into free territory. I can't be held as a slave there. This case would work its way all the way from a district court in St. Louis. The courthouse can be seen from the Gateway Arch. The Gateway Arch, in fact, frames this place where Dred Scott made his argument. It makes it from there all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in 1857, the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, delivers a striking decision in Dred Scott versus Sandford, saying, first of all, no, Dred Scott does not have his freedom by virtue of being in a northern territory. Second, he has no standing to sue, because as an African American, he is not a citizen of the United States. Now, you put your legal mind into this and you say, okay, case closed. Not for Roger Taney under the Supreme Court. They go on to say, well, guess what? That Missouri Compromise of 1820, which you're basing your case on, that divided the American territory into free territory and slave territory, that was unconstitutional. 37 years later, it's declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And in effect, what the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision does is it opens up virtually any territory, legally speaking, to slavery. Of course, the people on the ground won't allow that to happen. But this document, and we'll have a first edition of it here, an early printing of it, shows students just one of the most inflammatory Supreme Court decisions in American history. The Emancipation Proclamation, which is promulgated in September of 1862, takes effect January 1 of 1863. Everybody knows something about it. Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves in the South. That's a bit of a simplification, though, because what the Emancipation Proclamation does, and when you get down into the verbiage of this document, what you'll find is, yes, it frees the slaves in the South, but only in rebel territory. It's a very important distinction, because by the end of 1862, there were certain places within the South, in the southern states, that were under the control of the Union Army. Just to give one example, significant parts of Louisiana had already been regained by the Union Army and Navy. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply in those areas. Slaves in those areas remained slaves. It's a controversial part of the Emancipation Proclamation. A controversial part of the story is Lincoln moves toward this very radical decision that he makes in late 1862. But even Lincoln there has his limits. He says, I can't deprive people of their property in places that are loyal to the United States of America and its government. Now, that all would change come 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which declares that slavery is prohibited throughout the United States. But this document gets the ball rolling, so to speak.